Operation Source. In the autumn of 1943, the Kriegsmarine's pride and terror of the North Atlantic, the battleship Tirpitz, lay anchored in the fjords of Norway. A massive ship, heavily armed and heavily defended, she represented a constant threat to Allied convoys traveling to the Soviet Union via the Arctic route. Her mere presence forced the Royal Navy to divert resources and plan carefully every mission in northern waters. Conventional naval strikes had already been attempted. Bombers, surface ships, and submarines had tried, often with limited effect. Tirpitz was protected not only by its own guns, but by an extensive system of anti-aircraft defenses, coastal artillery, and minefields. The Allies needed a new approach. Enter the daring and unconventional solution: midget submarines. Tiny, nimble, and almost invisible, these two-man submarines, known as X-craft, were designed for one purpose: to infiltrate heavily defended harbors and destroy capital ships from beneath the waterline. Show diagram of X-craft. Each craft was only 15 meters long, powered by electric motors, and capable of carrying 2 tons of explosive charges. Their crews consisted of highly trained men, handpicked from the Royal Navy's elite submariners. They were expected to navigate narrow fjords, avoid detection, and plant explosives under the hull of a battleship that could flatten an entire convoy with a single broadside. Shift to operational planning maps. Operation Source was the culmination of months of preparation. British intelligence mapped the fjords in detail, photographing anti-submarine nets, minefields, and defensive positions. Crews rehearsed tirelessly in Scotland, simulating fjord conditions, perfecting silent navigation, and timing every maneuver down to the second. Fade to archival images of crews. The risks were extreme. Every patrol could end in capture, injury, or death. Yet these men volunteered willingly, fully aware that their mission would require courage, endurance, and a degree of precision rarely demanded in wartime. For them, failure was not an option, and success could change the balance of power in the northern seas. A short pause for dramatic effect. This is the story of Operation Source, the mission that brought the ingenuity of the Royal Navy, the bravery of its submariners, and the secret science of wartime explosives together in a daring attempt to neutralize the most feared German battleship afloat. Today, we explore the preparation, the journey, and the unprecedented challenges faced by the crews as they set out on one of the most audacious attacks of the Second World War. Training, preparation, and the journey to Norway. Before the operation could begin, the Royal Navy faced a unique challenge. No one had ever attempted an attack quite like this. Miniature submarines had been used before, but never against a ship as large, as heavily protected, or as strategically important as Tirpitz. If Operation Source was going to work, it would require exceptional preparation. Training took place in some of the most remote parts of Scotland. At Loch Cairnbawn, a quiet and isolated location chosen specifically for its resemblance to Norway's fjords. Here, the crews were introduced to the X-craft, small, cramped vessels with just enough room for the 2 submariners who would spend days submerged inside them. The conditions were unforgiving. Each craft contained basic navigation equipment, a small periscope, and cramped compartments filled with batteries, oxygen cylinders, and the all-important explosive charges. The men practiced navigating in near-total darkness, relying on instruments they had learned to monitor almost by instinct. Shift to physical training scenes. But the technical challenges were only part of the preparation. Crews underwent rigorous physical and psychological tests. They had to endure long hours in confined spaces, often in silence and always in danger. Engineers devised escape drills for emergencies, teaching the men how to exit a submerged craft, a procedure that offered slim chances of survival in real combat. They practiced towing. Each operational X-craft needed to be transported close to the Norwegian coast by a full-size submarine. Once near the target area, the midget boats would detach, navigate the final distance alone, and try to slip past patrols and anti-submarine nets. It was a delicate operation, and it had to be executed with precision. Cut to map of the route from Scotland to Norway. By early September 1943, the crews and their submarines were ready. 6 X-craft were assigned to the mission: X5, X6, X7, X8, X9, and X10. Each was paired with a towing submarine, and together they formed a small, covert flotilla. Their route would take them north along the coast of the United Kingdom, before turning east toward Norway, a journey of several days beneath unpredictable seas. The tow itself was extremely risky. The X-craft were attached by long steel cables, and the strain of the ocean often caused trouble. In heavy seas, the miniature vessels pitched and rolled violently. If the cable snapped, it could be catastrophic. During the actual transit, this danger became reality. Archival recordings of radio logs appear. X9 was lost early in the voyage. She disappeared during the tow, likely pulled under by a failure in the connection system. The submarine towing her felt the sudden release of tension, but when the crew looked aft, the midget craft had vanished. There were no survivors. Shortly after, X8 encountered similar issues. Her explosive charges became unstable during the transit and had to be jettisoned. The damage was so severe that she could no longer continue. X8's crew were recovered, and the miniature vessel was scuttled. Returned to surviving crews. For the remaining craft, X5, X6, X7, and X10, the mission had grown even more urgent. They were now the only hope of completing Operation Source, yet morale remained steady. Every man understood the importance of the mission. Tirpitz tied down entire British fleets and threatened the lifeline to the Soviet Union. Damaging her, even temporarily, would be considered a strategic victory. As the flotilla neared the Norwegian coast, weather conditions grew harsher. Fog drifted across the water, the temperature dropped, and the fjords themselves created unpredictable currents. The crews prepared for the final phase, detaching from their towing submarines and navigating independently toward the heavily defended anchorage at Fjord. Cut to last preparations inside each X-craft. Inside their miniature vessels, the commanders checked equipment, tested oxygen systems, and secured the explosive charges. They knew that once detached, they would be entirely alone, navigating through one of the most fortified waterways in Europe. On the evening of September 20th, 1943, the order was given. One by one, the 4 surviving X-craft slipped their tow cables and began their silent approach into the fjord. Ahead of them lay anti-submarine nets, patrol boats, and the towering hull of the most feared battleship in northern waters. The attack was about to begin. The infiltration, entering the fjord, and first contact with Tirpitz. Once detached from their towing submarines, the X-craft began the most dangerous phase of Operation Source, the infiltration of Fjord. Each craft had to navigate a long and narrow coastal channel, filled with shifting currents, hidden rocks, and layers of German defenses that grew heavier as they progressed. Cut to overview map of the fjord. Fjord was not chosen by accident. It offered natural protection, tall mountains on both sides and deep, cold waters that could easily conceal a battleship the size of Tirpitz. But these same features created a maze for the approaching X-craft. Narrow passages required precise navigation. Underwater terrain forced the commanders to constantly adjust depth. At every point, a miscalculation could bring the mission to an end. X-10 led the approach, followed by X6, X7, and the elusive X5. The crews relied on compass bearings and depth readings, surfacing occasionally to confirm their position. A brief look through the periscope offered glimpses of the sky, the shadows of mountains, or the lights of patrol vessels. Each sighting had to be measured carefully. Too much exposure risked detection. Too little visibility risked straying into the shallows. Inside the cabins, conditions grew increasingly difficult. Battery power was limited. Oxygen supplies were calculated precisely for the mission's duration. Carbon dioxide began to accumulate. The crewmen worked in near silence, aware that noise could travel through the water. Every movement was deliberate. Every sound was monitored. switched to German defensive network. But the greatest challenge lay ahead. The first of several anti-submarine nets. These barriers consisted of steel mesh anchored across strategic areas, designed to prevent enemy submarines from entering the fjord. Patrol boats frequently checked the nets, searching for breaches or suspicious activity. Return to X6, commanded by Lieutenant Donald Cameron. X6 approached the net system just before dawn. Cameron maneuvered carefully, searching for weaknesses. The underwater currents pressed the craft sideways, increasing the risk of entanglement. After several tense minutes, he located a small gap where the net had been distorted by tidal movement. With only a few inches to spare, X6 edged through, scraping against the barrier but avoiding damage. X7, under Lieutenant Godfrey Place, faced even greater difficulty. The currents forced the miniature submarine directly into the net. For a moment, it seemed the mission would end here. The crew reversed engines, adjusting trim, working meticulously to free the vessel. After repeated attempts, X7 managed to slip through, but only by sheer precision and determination. The Germans had installed not one, but 3 separate net barriers, each more heavily guarded than the last. Beyond them lay patrol craft, watchtowers, and hydrophones designed to detect underwater movement. The X-craft commanders had studied these defenses in advance, aware that any mistake would alert the garrison. Return to the narrative. By mid-morning, the fog began to settle in the fjord, a rare stroke of good fortune. Visibility dropped, reducing the chances of the X-craft being sighted from above. The still surface masked the movement beneath, allowing the submarines to continue their approach. And then, as they cleared the final underwater barrier, the target finally came into sight. Rising from the water like a fortress of steel, Tirpitz anchored in a quiet corner of the fjord, protected by mountains, nets, and layers of defenses. Even from a distance, her size was overwhelming. She displaced over 42,000 tons and carried some of the most advanced naval artillery in Europe. For the crews of X6 and X7, this was the first time they had ever seen their target in person. Months of planning and training had led them to this moment. They now had one task left: reach the underside of the battleship and place their explosive charges directly beneath her hull. Shift back to the unseen struggle underwater. But the final approach was far from simple. The fjord's waters grew shallow near the anchorage. Underwater cables, nets, and mooring lines created unexpected obstacles. Turning the miniature submarines required careful adjustments. Every movement was fraught with risk. In X6, Cameron navigated through a narrow stretch near the shore, hugging the seabed to avoid detection. The craft's periscope was damaged earlier by floating debris, forcing the crew to rely on dead reckoning. They moved forward at a slow and deliberate pace, guided only by instruments and instinct. Cut to X7. X7 approached from a different angle. Place intended to position his charges as close as possible to the engine room of Tirpitz, maximizing the structural damage. His crew monitored the time carefully. If delayed too long, oxygen levels would become critical. A brief note on X5. Little is known about the exact movements of X5. Historical evidence suggests she reached the outer defensive perimeter, but she likely came under fire or became entangled in defensive nets. X5 never made it to the battleship, and she did not return. As noon approached, the 2 operational X-craft, X6 and X7, entered the final phase of the attack. They had reached the anchorage. The battleship towered above them. The next minutes would determine whether Operation Source succeeded or failed. What followed was one of the most daring underwater attacks of the Second World War, an assault carried out by hand-picked crews and vessels no larger than a truck. Against all odds, they were now within striking distance of the German Navy's most feared capital ship.